So today we have my Q&A/review/guide for the newest character A2. I'll be answering some questions about this character, talk about her pros and cons, go over some of the important details that I feel like not too many people talk about, and basically give you guys everything there is to know about A2. Is it better to use A2 manually, or is it better to use autoplay? To answer this question, we have to first take a look at how her normal attacks work. A2 has a rocket launcher type weapon, and typically, rocket launcher units can spam their normal attacks. But for A2's case, she has a relatively long animation at the end of her attack, which cripples her ability to spam her normals. So because of that, using her manually with the purpose of being a battery is not really a good option. Also, when you take a look at her kit, you will see that she is made to do fully charged attacks, and doing so is a lot more consistent when you have autoplay turned on. So yes, generally speaking, you should be fine using autoplay, but on the other hand, there are still some situations where using her manually can be better. If you are in stages with a ton of enemies that are scattered on the field, sometimes autoplay is going to lock to a specific target that is farther away from the rest of your enemies. You will also encounter some scenarios where autoplay is going to ignore the high priority targets, like the raptors that jumps towards your team. So in that case, it's going to be much better to use her manually so that you can better place your shots where it can hit the most enemies. Also, when you go up against enemies that have weak points popping up, having autoplay turned on can actually mess up your attacks. And I became aware of this when I was trying out A2 against Chatterbox. If you have autoplay turned on and you try to manually aim A2's attacks towards the weak point, the auto-targeting is going to redirect your crosshair towards the center of Chatterbox. And because A2 has a pretty long animation at the end of her attack, she will be releasing her attack after autoplay redirects your crosshair away from the weak point. So this can be very annoying, especially because the laser attack can fully wipe your team. Although, the good thing is that A2's fully charged attack can actually break the weak point in just one hit. But always remember to disable autoplay first so that you can properly aim her attacks yourself. How good is A2's AoE and burst gauge generation compared to the other units? And what are the downsides to her normal attacks if any? So let's begin with the first one. I'm actually inclined to say that A2 has the best AoE normal attacks in the game. The only other characters that can really be in this conversation are Laplace, Power, and Blue Ocean Neon. You can maybe consider Modernia because her burst is technically AoE, but we're only going to focus on the other three. A2's charge attacks definitely have a bigger range than Power and Laplace, and I would say that it's close to what Blue Ocean Neon has on her burst, but it's not that big of a difference. With that being said, having this much AoE can be good or bad, depending on the enemy you're up against. Obviously, against multiple enemies, A2 is going to be very useful. Also during my testing, I was actually able to get rid of the projectiles from Blacksmith, Chatterbox, Modernia, and Altizen, just by simply spamming A2's normal attacks. Against Altizen, on top of being able to break the turrets efficiently, you will also be able to hit the projectiles as they are coming out. But a big downside to having this much AoE is that you're breaking boss parts that you are not supposed to. So going back to what I mentioned before, I said that I was able to get rid of projectiles from Chatterbox by spamming A2's attacks. But during the process, I was also chipping away the life bar on the headpiece. And if you did not know, breaking Chatterbox's head is going to put him into berserk mode, which will make him do a jumping attack on steroids and will most likely wipe your team. And this is pretty much the same with the Modernia boss fight. What I normally do is I break Modernia's core, and then I try to avoid breaking her wings and just focus all of my attacks at the center. Because if you break her wings, Modernia is going to teleport around and throw a bunch of projectiles, and then she will be doing another laser attack, so it's not going to be a fun time. So if you are going up against these types of bosses, I will just try to avoid using A2, not unless you can handle these bosses going into berserk mode. How do you keep her mode be passive, and do you actually need a 100% uptime on this buff? The short and simple answer for this is yes. It is very possible for her burst effects to be permanent, especially once you get a few upgrades on her burst, because this will lower the amount of HP that she is losing. And if you use the right characters on your team, it will be a lot easier to keep this buff. And speaking of characters, I think it's a good time to go over my tier list for the best healers for A2. So my tier list is divided into 5 tiers. We have the best healers for A2. These are the ones that can solo heal your team, and they also have enough healing output to keep A2 above 40% HP. Next we have the good healers, and these characters are almost as good as the best ones, if not for a few downsides. And then we also have the pocket healers. And these characters are the ones that typically don't have enough healing for them to be used as a solo healer, but they still have great synergy with A2, so you can still use them as a secondary healer. Next we have the usable/situational healers, who I don't really recommend using with A2, but you can still do so in some specific scenarios. And for the last one, we have the rest of the healers that don't really have good synergy with A2, so not unless you have some sort of 1000 IQ off meta team that makes use of any of these characters, then I would just try to avoid about using them with A2. For the characters on top of the list, we have Blanc and Pepper. Blanc is going to be your most comfortable pick, simply because she has a ton of healing on top of her other utility. Although, you absolutely need to run Blanc with Noir so that you have a 20-second cooldown instead of 60. I can even confidently say that Blanc can be put on a higher tier separately, just because of how easy it is to run A2 with Blanc if you have Noir. As for Pepper, she is a really good option, but I do think that you need a lot more investment on Pepper, and you also need to use Privity along with the cooldown reduction character. The majority of Pepper's healing is from her burst, so having a cooldown reduction character like Dala is going to be very useful. Pepper also comes with decent healing from her skill 1, but you need to use Privity so that you can trigger her skill 1 more often, and additionally, I also recommend that you use the Resilience Cube. So next up, we have the good healer options. Bay Goddess Mary is another really good healer, but just like Pepper, you would also want to use a cooldown reduction character because her healing activates when entering full burst. She has a really good healing output, but the reason why I did not put her higher on the list is because she doesn't have any other sources for healing outside of her skill 1. But aside from that, you can even argue that Bay Goddess Mary should be on the same tier as Blanc and Pepper. The next character on this tier is Rapunzel. Out of all the healers in the game, Rapunzel provides the most healing. Her healing is consistent because it activates when she does fully charged attacks, but the problem with Rapunzel is that she puts out too much healing. This character is a really good healer, but that is pretty much all she does. So when you start to factor in different types of content like the raids, you have a few other characters that can fill the healer slot better because they can both heal and increase your damage all at the same time. And for the next one, we have Uni and Folkwang. These characters are really good, but just like what I mentioned before, they actually don't have enough healing for them to be used as a solo healer. I only recommend these characters if you are having trouble keeping A2's HP above 40% even after using the healers on the higher tiers. Uni is a really good option for A2 because her skill 1 is going to help A2's damage, and although her lifesteal buff is not that good, it is still very consistent. But if there's one thing that surprised me, it's that Folkwang is doing much better than I expected. Folkwang doesn't really get a lot of use, maybe except for the fan art outside of the game, but during my testing for A2, I found that A2 can easily go back up to max HP, even with Folkwang only having level 1 skills. So if you are having trouble keeping A2's HP at a high percent, I recommend that you try Folkwang if you can afford to run a 1-2-2 team. Next up, we have the situational picks / usable characters. These characters are not necessarily bad, but I'm putting them low on the list because you would rather have these characters on a different team, especially when we are talking about raids. Helm is a viable pick for A2, but you would rather have Helm on a team with an AR or machine gun DPS. And it's pretty much the same thing for Noise. She is also usable for A2, but you would rather put Noise in a team with 2B or a Sparkling Summer. So looking at the bigger picture, also mainly talking about raids, these characters are usable for A2, but you will get more value out of them in other teams. And then lastly, at the very bottom of the list, we have the healers that don't work with A2 whatsoever. For some of them like Soda, maybe I just don't have them built, that's why they don't work, but looking at their skills, I don't really see how they can be better options compared to the other ones higher on the list. We spent quite a bit of time on this, but now let's move on to the second part of this question. Do you actually need 100% uptime on this buff? So preferably, you would want to make this buff permanent, and it is very possible after you get a few upgrades on her burst, and if you are using the healers on top of my tier list. But with that being said, having like a 90% uptime is going to be fine as well. Sometimes you will end up having slow rotations, maybe because you don't have enough energy generation, or maybe you don't have a cooldown reduction character. But if you lose the mode B buff, it shouldn't really matter all that much, as long as you can use A2's burst a few seconds later. This actually happens to me when I'm using Bay Goddess Mary. If I don't use a cooldown reduction character, A2 is guaranteed to lose her buff at the end of my second rotation. This might sound really bad, but because I have my rotation set up to where A2 is using her burst on the third rotation, A2 doesn't go more than 10 seconds without getting her buff again. Having a cooldown reduction character is absolutely crucial for building a really good team around 2B. It might be obvious for some people because having a cooldown reduction character is always good, but this is especially important for A2 because most of the healers in the game have the majority of their healing either locked behind using their burst or locked behind their team being able to enter full burst mode. So in general, your team will look like this. You will have one healer, a cooldown reduction character, A2, a pocket healer or DPS, and Flex. I have tried this team composition template on different healers and different compositions that make sense, and so far, all of them line up with this template. Moving on, let's talk about how to build A2. When it comes to her skills, I recommend that you prioritize upgrading her burst. Not only does the damage increase per upgrade, but the amount of HP that she is losing per second also decreases. So upgrading this will make it a lot easier for you to keep her HP above 40%, letting you keep her buff more consistently. For the next one, I recommend upgrading her skill 1 because this skill is going to be effective all around. It increases your charge damage and explosion radius after using her burst. So this is going to be generally more useful compared to her skill 2 that does increase additional damage, but the other half will only increase damage to enemy parts. And more often than not, your enemies will not have breakable parts, especially if you are using her outside of boss fights. But if you can see yourself mainly using her for boss fights, then upgrading her skill 2 first will be a better move. Although keep in mind that generally, as a DPS, your end goal is to fully max out all of her skills. As for equipment, overload her helmet first, then gloves, chest piece, then boots, in that specific order. And just like every other rocket launcher or sniper DPS, the main stats that you are looking for are attack percent, charging speed, and charge damage. Elemental damage and crit can also be decent, especially with higher rolls, but you would still want to stick with the other three. When it comes to harmony cubes, I can sit here and say that you can use Onslaught or Adjutant, but realistically, they are not going to be your best options. If you are playing your cards right, you at least have one of these cubes at level 5 or higher. And the ones I'm talking about are Resilience, Bastion, and Assault Cube. These ones are the most versatile, so the chances of you having more levels on these is pretty high. And for me, the best cube for A2 is going to be Resilience. Aside from this, there's going to be very little difference between the other cubes, especially if you don't have them at level 5 or higher. Now let's talk about max limit breaking and getting core ups for A2. I have seen a lot of people say that getting copies for A2 is going to be bad because of her HP loss mechanic on her burst. But for me, you are honestly not getting that much HP from limit breaks, so you don't have to worry about this if you really want to get her wallpaper. And if you do end up having a bit more trouble, upgrading your healers will absolutely counterbalance the HP loss on A2. Personally, I did not get her to max limit break because she is already good even if you only have a single copy. A2 is also your typical attack scaling DPS, so she doesn't really get much out of max limit breaks or core ups compared to a character that scales on both HP and attack like 2B. Can you actually use A2 and 2B on the same team? And how good is that team going to be? So yes, technically you can use the two of them on the same team, but I would say that this is more like a for fun team than anything else. If you decide to use A2 and 2B on the same team, you will end up compromising on either one of them because they don't have too many support characters in common. The best one that I could come up with is a team with Goddess Mary, Noise, Dala, A2, and 2B. This team has a good amount of healing for A2, and it also has HP increase, which will be useful for 2B. And if you ever want to try this team, always make sure that you use Noise and 2B on the same rotation. What I do is I use Goddess Mary and A2's burst on the first rotation, and then I pop Noise and 2B's burst on the second one. Basically just alternating these two. It definitely works, and they do decent amounts of damage, but I still think that using them in separate teams is still going to be better. Is it worth pulling for A2? And if you can only afford to get one character, is it better to go with A2 over 2B? Obviously, these two characters have their own strengths and weaknesses, but if I'm being honest, I would recommend going for 2B instead of A2. I absolutely like A2 as much as the other guy, but 2B is just a really good character for many reasons outside of her damage output. 2B is a defender class damage dealer, which will open up a lot of new team compositions in your account. So unlike your typical attacker DPS that will be fighting over the same supports, you can run 2B with a completely different set of support characters that can increase her HP, which will then increase her attack in return. Having this option for team compositions is really good, especially when you are trying to form different teams for raids. Yes, 2B is a high investment character, but I do think that she is a lot more comfortable to use for the majority of the players. Not everyone is going to enjoy the high risk, high reward gameplay for A2, so having a character that is basically the complete opposite of that is a lot more favorable for some people. As for my ratings for A2, I actually made a small change. So previously, I had early and late campaign at double S tier, solo boss fights at S tier, bosses with ads on triple S tier, and A tier for PvP. The only changes I will make is I will put an asterisk on my ratings for the early campaign and solo boss fights. A2 is good for the early campaign, but how good she is really depends on whether you have a good healer on your team or not. Healers in this game are not easy to come by, especially considering that one of the best healers is the Pilgrim, the other one is a limited character, and you need to pair Blanc with Noir to make her usable. So I just think that it's very unlikely for newer players to get a good healing character early on. As for the solo boss fight, I'm putting an asterisk because it really depends on which boss you go up against. If the boss has no breakable parts, then A2 will probably stay on S tier, And if the boss has breakable parts that you need to avoid breaking, but you can't because of A2, then I would put her down to A tier, maybe even B tier, depending on how bad the consequence is. But in the best case scenario, where you have to break all of the boss parts with no consequence in return, I will be giving A2 a double S tier rating. So yeah, hopefully I was able to cover the majority, if not all of the things there is to know about A2. If you have any more questions, feel free to put it down in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.